Hello, very welcome to this special webinar from WSET about the question of terroir in spirits. My name is Charlie McCarthy. I'm Business Development Manager for Spirits within WSET across Europe, Middle East and Africa. And I'm joined today by a panel of experts and producers and also some very interesting video contributions. What is terroir? It's a bit of a burning question. So what is terroir? Terroir is a kind of controversial word, and to guide us through this initial conversation about terroir, I'm going to invite in the wonderful Dawn Davies, who is head buyer at Speciality Drinks. Dawn is a master of wine, and she's also one of the leading experts in the UK in the world of spirits. So she's probably very uniquely placed to discuss with us what this word terroir means, because it kind of is more associated with wines than with spirits. Would that be fair to say, Dawn?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, I'm probably a terroirist. You can take it how you want to take that. I think it's a hugely misused word today. I think it's become a trendy term, innovation, things like craft. It's joining those ranks, and it's a real shame because actually terroir is hugely important. And if we look at wine, it's the foundation on which we base wine. It's enshrined in law, increasingly, well, in Europe especially, but increasingly all over wine-making regions. You have GIs, you have AOCs, you have DOCGs, all of these terms encompass at their heart the concept of terroir. And if we look at the concept terroir in its truest form, for me, it's the expression of the land and its surroundings in the glass. And I think one of the most dramatic ways I can kind of give an example of it is to look at Catena's White Bones and White Stones wines. Same vineyard, pretty much rows apart. The difference in flavor between those two wines is absolutely phenomenal.
Wow.
That is the definition of terroir. When I can stick my nose into a glass and say, this is Chianti grown on this part of the region, in this part of the region. From potentially even down to the vineyard, if you're looking at, say, Barolo, I think, and of course, Burgundy. And I think that concept, that is what the heart of terroir should be about. And terroir was produced, the concept of terroir, has a huge history. I think, Charlie, you've been reading a bit about it over the weekend. But
I have. Anybody wants to do a bit of a deep dive into the history and development of the French concept of terroir, you can get stuck into this book. It's basically Tasting French Terroir by Thomas Parker. It is proper cultural dive going back to kind of the 1300s and through the Renaissance and into the birth of the Appellation d'Origine regulations and up to modern day. The other one that I've been reading, which is quite interesting, and we might take a detour into that a bit later, is Rob Arnold's recent book called The Terroir of Whiskey. Now, anybody who knows me knows that conversation will always turn to whiskey eventually. However, within the context of what we're looking at today, I think we're going to try to keep it mostly focused on unaged spirits, because at WSET, we always talk about the 4 stages of production. And there are going to be elements that come exclusively from the raw material. There are going to be flavor and texture elements that come from how you process our raw material, the fermentation. Then during distillation, our main purpose in distillation is to select and concentrate both the ethanols and the desirable congeners. And then you've got lots of things you can do post-distillation, one of which is wood aging. Now, I know you've got strong views about wood aging and terroir, Dawn.
Yes, I do. I think, if you're talking, and, I'm sure both gentlemen on either side of me will definitely, when we come to talk about unaged spirits or aged spirits, we'll be talking about how actually where you age something is hugely important to the concept of, and I'm going to put this out there, in spirits, not necessarily terroir, because you're not, in most cases, and I'm putting in most cases, tasting terroir. You are tasting effects of oak aging, your effects of still, your effects of fermentation. it is, we'll definitely with Benoit and Jesse very much talk about there are exceptions to this rule. But when wood overpowers and becomes the dominant flavor, that is when terroir gets lost. And when you're putting new oak onto things, when you're putting a very powerful long aging process in, how much of that spirit is still left behind, which would be the original carrier of those sense of flavors, those sense of place. So for me, I think when we're talking about spirits, it's very much more a sense of place. You're not necessarily tasting the soil and the climate around it. You know, it is very much to do with the culture, the history, the stills, the types of yeast you're using. You know, all of these are such huge providers of flavor. If we, you know, and I'm sure Benoit will talk about it a bit later, you know, we look at somewhere like Hampden and the use of muck and dunder. You know, again, that's part of that place. That is part of Hampden. But is that terroir? You know, I think it's looking maybe at spirits in a very different way to wine. And why should spirits replicate wine?
No, exactly.
Why not own their own unique identity? And I think that's maybe the challenge I'm throwing out there today, being a bit controversial about.
So just so we can kind of anchor ourselves for everybody viewing in a kind of a common foundation, I'm going to give you the European Union legal definition of what terroir is. And it's products that possess terroir are those whose quality or characteristics are essentially or exclusively due to a particular geographic environment with its inherent natural and human factors. Okay, so we are going to open this up in a little while to the wonderful Benoit Bail-Danel, who is going to talk us through all things agricole rum. And we are then going to be joined by Jesse Estes from Ocho Tequila, and he's going to talk about La Alteña Distillery and about the interesting example that blue agave in particular gives us to compare various different terroirs. But before we do that, we are going to have a quick poll. So everybody viewing, could you please participate in the poll and just simply tell us, do you believe that terroir exists in spirits? And as you're doing that, we are then going to watch a video from the fantastic Francesca Nonino of Nonino Grappa. And Nonino Grappa is, I think, a really interesting place to start the conversation around terroir. So we have 3 samples of their grappa. Myself and Dawn are going to have a little comparative taste during the video and after the video. But for now, our wonderful host, Jenny, is going to play the video of Nonino Grappa. Oh, and that's a very strong result on the poll.
Hello everyone, I'm Francesca Nonino. I'm the 6th generation of Nonino family, and I'm really happy to be able to talk with you about the history of Grappa and how my grandparents' passion for Friuli terroir transformed this spirit from what was perceived as a simple, low-quality product into a distillate that today represents Italian excellence all over the world. And as in any other story, we need to start from the beginning. Grappa, the Italian pomace distillate distilled in Italy, was born in the 15th century in the northeast of Italy, precisely in Friuli. At the time, pomace, the skin, residual pulp, juice of the grape pressed for making wine, was considered just a leftover. But farmers were smart enough to understand that because pomace contained sugar, it could be fermented, and because it could be fermented, they could distill it. And so they created this spirit that was almost an everyday medicine. They used to drink grappa when their teeth ache, to fight the cold weather, to find the energy to go work in the field. But because distilling at home it was illegal, they needed to stock all the pomace and wait for the perfect weather, like a cloudy day or a storm, to be able to cover the alcohol steam and not getting cut. If we add to that the fact that the way of distilling was really rustic because they used to distill using direct fire, we can understand why Grappa was considered really a fiery spirit, and it was called the fire water that was able to burn away even hunger. But the perception of Grappa shifted completely with my grandparents. My grandfather, the fourth generation of a family of distillers since 1897, understood that the quality of Grappa was directly and essentially connected with the quality of pomace you choose to distill. He saw Grappa as a spirit really linked with terroir. He thought as Grappa as the soul of the vineyard, and he thought that the master distiller was able to prove their ability if they were able to capture through distillation the essence of the grape and transferring it into the glass. He was the very first one to see the potential of the pomace if distilled fresh. And so he decided to distill only fresh pomace and not any pomace. He decided to distill only selected pomace from the best wineries in Friuli. And to be able to distill fresh, he did what I see as a love declaration to pomace. He built a unique distillery in the world. Instead of us having 6 or 12 postil like Grappa distillery have even today, he built a distillery with 66 artisanal pot still, but those pot still were distilling only during the harvest. Instead of 8 months per year, 8 weeks per year. But during those weeks, they were distilling 24 hours per day, 7 days of the week to really respect the freshness of the pomace. It was a research to maintain the absolute quality in the distillation. It was a research that had the aim of proving to the final consumer the quality Grappa could have. And it was a research that lasted for 10 years. It started with looking for traceability of the raw material. My grandparents started to put on each of their Grappa bottle a sort of identity card. They wrote on the label how many kilograms of pomace they distill, from which wineries the pomace came from, how many liters of Grappa they obtained from those pomaces. And so it finally arrived to the revolutionary idea, trying to distill for the very first time the first single variety pomace, Grappa. It was something that was never done before, because traditionally pomace being seen as a leftover was also treated like one, and so pomace were all mixed together with any type of logic. And also because distiller thought that the white pomaces that arrive at the distillery virgin needed the already fermented red pomaces to start their fermentation process. But my grandparents find a way, and to prove their idea, they decided to start with a pomace from a vineyard that was really connected with the history, the culture of Friuli Venezia Giulia. They picked Piccolita, an indigenous variety from Friuli Venezia Giulia that suffered of floral abortion. And for this reason, the harvests are really small, but the grape it produces are amazing, full of sweetness, full of aromatic characteristics. They're almost like a nectar. My grandmother went vineyard to vineyard to pick the best vineyard of Piccolite. And the 1st December 1973, when the first drop of Piccolite Monovitigno Cru Nonino came out of the glass bell, my grandmother started shouting, "Benito, Benito, we did it!" Because the distillery was filled with this perfume of quince, acacia honey, fig, raisin, the exact same perfume my grandmother smelled in the Piccolite vineyard. Finally, the connection Grappa Terroir was made, and it was so stunning that even the most skeptical ones started to look at Grappa in a completely different way. This revolution of Piccolite single variety opened up for Grappa even the foreigner market, having now Grappa being able to represent in the most beautiful, iconic restaurant the Italian excellence. And I would like to conclude my speech with a quote from the New York Times. For uncounted decades, Grappa was little more than a cheap, portable form of central eating for peasants in the northern Italy. Fancier Italians and foreigners disdained it, but that was before the Noninos of Percoto came to prominence. Thank you very much, and enjoy Grappa! Cheers!
Cool. So speaking of enjoying grappa, we have got, Dawn and I have got 3 grappas in front of us. And Dawn, I don't believe I've given you the identity of each of them. It's just a...
No idea. It's just a blind tasting. I did my MW like a long time ago.
I know.
There's a reason I don't do blind tasting anymore.
So just let you know, bottle number 1 is Picolit, which is what Francesca was just talking about there. Bottle number 2 is Fragolino, which is, I believe, a red wine grape that has quite a lot of strawberry characteristics. And Grappa number 3 is Ribolla, which is...
Ribolla Jaya, yeah.
Yeah, so for me, I think what before we get into the individual liquids in front of us, I think what they're doing that's super interesting is obviously they've got a consistency of production process across everything that they do. They take the pomace, they ferment it in stainless steel tanks, temperature controlled. They use these very interesting steam injection copper stills to distill. And the fact that they're using single grape varieties, I think, is a really interesting into this idea of terroir and spirits. I've got a favorite of these 3. Well, I think they're all amazing. I really like the Picolit, though. I really like number 1. I think it touches a lot of different areas.
I think the question to throw back here is, yes, I stick my nose in these and I know it's Grappa.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I stick my nose in it and I can probably pick out characters from those grape varieties that I know. But can I stick my nose into it and say that that's Picolit from that vineyard?
That's an interesting question. Now, I don't have enough expertise in different Picolit to know.
And you know, if we think about Grappa and how Grappa is produced, a lot of Grappa producers are buying from all over.
Mm-hmm.
Friuli or Veneto or wherever they're producing from. So they're not talking about one terroir, they're talking about multiple terroirs.
Mm-hmm. So are we then talking about an expression of a particular variety?
But that's not terroir. That's an expression of the product you're making. And that's a very, very different concept. Mm-hmm. So I stick my nose in that. Yep. And I can recognize Picolit, and I agree. I love that Picolit. It's fresh, it's vibrant, it's got florals, it's got the soft, ripe fruits that I would expect in Picolit. The Fragola, maybe less so. I'm not getting that strawberry that I associate with, but I think you get a little bit that tannin from the grape, which is normal. I like the Ribolla Jaya actually. It's
very pleasant. Mm. It's got a lot of that kind of almond and fruit and honey.
Yeah, and it's got, I think for me, Ribolla has that, again, that slightly sort of herbaceous tone, which I really am getting coming through this. But that's not terroir, I'm just smelling the grape. I could do the same with a Chardonnay from California and a Chardonnay from Burgundy, but they'd be very different beasts.
When we're zeroing in then on the concept of terroir, in your opinion, does it have to be a single field or a single territory?
I think I have to be able to put my nose in it and really hone down if we go back to the concept of exactly where it's from. Now, you can talk about spirits like that because I think, and both the gentlemen will 100%, be able to argue this. If I look at one of my patents in Life Claran, yes, I do think there's a sense of place in that. But that's going back to the sense of place. I don't think you're talking in the same way about terroir as in, if you go to a
specificity. That specificity is maybe what we're talking
about.
Let
me give you an example. If you do your MS, your Master Sommelier, not your MW, I think they're very different. Your MS is really, really testing your sense of terroir. You have to be able to tell individual vineyards in Burgundy. Mm-hmm. Now, that's terroir. Now, I can pick up a glass of, say, a Jamaican rum. I'm going back to Jamaica, it's an easy one. Or actually Barbados, rum from Barbados. I can probably tell you if it's been Asian origin and, it definitely I know the distillery characters. That's a distillery character. That is a sense of place.
Okay.
Is it terroir? Because if you think about, let's say, molasses, you get molasses from all over the world. Not necessarily from one.
And molasses, it doesn't really carry a sense of place the way that, let's say, sugarcane juice does.
No, I mean, you could argue that because of the process that's gone on behind it, same with grain, yes, I can stick my nose in and say this is a Canadian rye. But can I have, hello, Billy, but can I say that this is a Canadian rye from this part of Canada? unless I'm very familiar with the distillery. And again, I'm saying sense of place. I'm not saying there's no concept of terroir. Take a cognac from Borderies. Yes, I can feel that that is from Borderies because there is something coming through there. But can I narrow it down to real specifics? And I think that's where wine takes terroir in a much more focused sense than spirit. So maybe that's the way of putting it.
Okay, well,
that's shot by about 50 million.
No, I know we like to do controversy. In fact, I was chatting with our CEO Ian Harris about this, and he is a fantastic fan of the Borderie terroir. And so this is an ongoing conversation. If anybody was going, why were we both just saying Billy Abbott from the Whiskey Exchange just called us both blasphemers for talking about molasses in that way. If you do have any comments, please do add them in the chat below. If you have any questions, put them into the Q&A section. We won't be able to address them live immediately, but we'll address them at the end of the session. We'll have a little Q&A session. For me, I think this is an interesting conversation because we're separating out how when we look at qualifying and judging the quality of spirits using the systematic approach to tasting at level 2 and at level 3, one of the criterion is we look at the balance of aromatics, the balance of the texture, the length, the intensity, the complexity, but we also look at a separate concept, which is expressiveness. And for me, each of these 3 grappas that we have here is fantastically expressive of the grape, fantastically expressive of the way that that grape is then fermented and distilled and rested and bottled. And the place very much, you can kind of tell Nonino does have a particular style that you can really pick out. For me, these are all extraordinarily expressive, but does that mean they have terroir? That is the interesting question. We're going to open this out to Benoit. Benoit Bail-Danel is he's an authority on rum agricole. Rum agricole, for those who don't know, is very much like molasses-based rum, except rather than sending the sugar cane juice off to be made into sugar and have a byproduct called molasses, you are fermenting the sugar cane juice straight away. So you've got a few areas here that are particularly interesting. It's going to be made in Martinique, it's going to be made in Guadeloupe. There's different aspects to the island, there's different varieties of sugar cane, and there's different microbial activities that can happen in the various different distilleries. Benoit, does terroir exist in agricole rum?
Definitely. I mean, just like in wine, since agricole rum is almost only produced in French islands or French territories, they basically copied the concept from the winemakers or even cognac makers. And yes, they have. Let's just take the example of Martinique, which is the most well-known agricole producer in the world right now. We have 8 different or 10 different distilleries on the island, and they all have their very own microclimates and terroirs all around the distillery, which makes it very interesting because each distillery is going to have a different taste at the end. I mean, the products from the distilleries are going to have a different taste, even if it comes from the same island. And on the other hand, the local AOC, so the Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée, which exists in Martinique for rum, is going to bring back together all these different tastes to one signature taste, which is the signature taste from AOC rum from Martinique. So yeah, terroir definitely exists in agricole rum.
And if you had to kind of pick 2 expressions of agricole rum and say these are similarly made, but they have a different variety of sugarcane or they have a different aspect to the land, do you think you could very confidently say field A, field B?
I probably could make the difference from one distillery to another. Maybe not the different fields inside of one distillery, because I don't know all the taste of all the different fields, of course. But on the same island, I could probably differentiate all the different distilleries, yeah. And
is there a kind of broad difference between the Guadeloupe style and the Martinique style, or do they just share so many things in common?
They have some stuff in common, but there are also very big differences. Maybe less in the fact that both are mostly using sugarcane juice, of course, but on the other hand, the know-how and the process, how they produce rum, is first of all different. Then also the soils are different between Guadeloupe and Martinique, since only in Martinique or only in Guadeloupe you have so many different soils. So there can definitely not be the same in Martinique and in Guadeloupe. And they are not necessarily using the same sugarcane varieties in the end to produce rum. So yeah, they're completely different.
Okay, and I've got, if you do happen to have an agricole rum to hand, please.
Yeah, sure.
I've got Clément from Martinique here. I'm guessing you have Depaz?
I have some Depaz and not any Depaz, which is very interesting. When we're talking about terroir, here, for example, I got a bottle from the cuvée Papao, and Papao is actually made with sugarcane from only one plot.
Okay.
We are taking one specific field with one specific sugarcane type, and we are making one reference in our range in a very limited edition, of course, since the field is not endless. And yeah, so this is, they exactly show you which sugarcane type has been used. So the B69 in this case, which is blue sugarcane, and the plot is called Papao, which gives his name to the bottling at the end of production. And each year they do this product again and again, and even from one year to another, you see the difference, just like in wine. Since harvest and climate and weather hasn't been the same in 2019, 2020, 2021, etc.
Amazing. So Dawn, throwing back to you. I don't know if you have the pop-out in front of you. I don't think either of us.
I wish I did, actually.
but
I'll be emailing my supplier today.
You got a couple of connections. But to bring it back to that concept of specificity then in terroir, do you believe that, you know, this is a viable concept?
I think if you're looking at terroir, the less you play around with that base initial product that you're trying to make something from, then the more likely you will have a sense of place coming through it. So 100%, I agree with Benoit. You know, the one thing that the agricole rums have done, and you know, is really take that sense of terroir and put it at their heart. So, you know, so many of the laws are regarding the sugarcane and how it's grown and where it's grown, and you know, that then bringing through into distillation, and especially if you're talking about using yeast from the surrounding area or using a yeast that allows that expression to come through, because a lot of standardized yeasts are literally just killing off terroir. That's where you'll get an expression of place through the liquid. So yes, I 100% agree with Benoit in the fact that you can have it, but you cannot muck around with that liquid in order to get to that final product. Because yes, distillation is a concentration of whatever comes before. But if you've mucked around with what came before, you won't get that as much, because other factors will come in and detract from it, is what I would say. I don't know, Benoit, Jesse, if you agree.
I completely agree. I mean,
I think this brings in two interesting aspects, one of which Jesse's going to definitely be able to speak to in a little while. But one of them is, you have the land. Is the ambient yeast in the distillery part of terroir, or is it not? Because if you look at something like, you know, a Jamaican style rum, or even but agricole rum, there's going to be a certain amount of microbial interaction and fermentation that is absolutely native to that geographical location. What do we feel about that?
Where is your distillery would be my question, because if your distillery is surrounding the land that the product is coming from, then yes, that is very much a part of terroir. If your distillery or winery or whatever is 500 miles away, let's take Messiah. You know, if we look at Messiah in Lebanon, they ship the grapes from the Bekaa Valley to the Beirut. If then wild yeast act on it, okay, maybe some have traveled in that little kind of truck, but then what's in the winery, is that the same terroir as the Bekaa Valley? Okay. I think for me, that's maybe where you can look at, and yeast is the biggest flavor provider in the world. I freaking love yeast. But Benoit, I mean, I don't know what you think about that.
Actually, I agree, since in Martinique, some distilleries even put it further. They managed to create, let's say create or find out their own yeasts on their distillery. Let's take Naison, for example, which have the distillery. All the fields from Naison are around the distillery, and they managed to find out that they had to isolate the yeasts, which are only available on their distillery, and to use them to produce their rum, actually. So even the yeast production happens on that estate, and that makes it more than unique, actually, since and the sugarcane, so the raw material, the soil, the climate, the microclimate, the weather, and the yeasts are specific from that one place in the world and cannot be copied anywhere else.
I think that and each category has a different relationship between all of these various different elements. Jesse was on the level 3 spirits course with me about 2 years ago. And we did a bit of a deep dive into Baijiu and Shochu and Shoju. And there's a really interesting case in, there's a strong aroma distillery in China, a Baijiu distillery, where they created an extension to the distillery. It's just about a mile down the road. But because of the native microbial biome that had built up in their clay fermentation pits, they could not reproduce the type of fermentation flavor profile that they had. And they ended up just saying, okay, well, we have this new distillery, but it's a different identity. It can't do what this old distillery does. And we just can't pretend that it is. We can't call it the same thing. Jesse, we are going to throw to you in a second. And we're going to watch a little video that you kindly provided us from La Alteña Distillery, the distillery where Ocho is made from. Thank you for being so patient and sitting there the whole time and listening.
No worries.
Prattle on. Could I just talk to you about fermentation, though? Because I think in tequila, it's an area that people kind of gloss over a little bit.
Well, so, you know, and I'm with Ocho, I really want to stick with Dawn's original definition of terroir, which is the one that I share, right? So I think when we talk about terroir of yeast and microbiomes and fermentation, to me, that's a different kind of terroir. We could talk about terroir of water, things like that, where the distillery is located. I understand what people are saying, but again, that's not my more narrow view of terroir that Dawn takes, which is really about the raw material itself. In our case, is blue agave, right?
Yeah.
So the fields behind me were harvested in 2013, and I'll talk more about why Tequila Ocho, I think, really is very much a terroir-driven spirit. But first of all, thank you guys for all your comments and questions. I've been enjoying seeing people from all over the world in this chat, which is very, very cool. So I think I have 10 people to convince that terroir does exist in spirits. There's 10 people. So I think Felice is probably one of them.
Felice is a really interesting guy, and he's got great. He's a fantastic educator. If anybody in Oslo or Norway or anywhere in the Nordics is looking for a spirits educator, get in touch with Felice at Sesto Senso. Really good guy. But before we do that, Jenny, who is the master of all things behind the scenes, is going to share a little video with us from the Alteña Distillery, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about why specifically tequila provides a really interesting template to explore the concept of terroir.
So Jenny, if you can leave the sound off, there's some nice music on here, but unfortunately I'm going to be stuck with my voice instead. So I'm just going to kind of explain what we're seeing on the video. So if you can leave the video audio off and my audio on. So obviously it starts in the field. Here we have typical highland field. You can see those little hijuelos were planted fairly recently. The field on the left is obviously being laid fallow. Those are slightly older plants. And again, that's a nice shot of two different fields, right? With a road separating them, which we will touch on what I mean by different fields. This is the harvest. So obviously everything done by hand by the jimadores, very skilled work, very, very hard work. And one of the things that we do with Tequila Ocho is only harvest the ripest plants from each field. So I'll talk about that a bit more as well. This is driving into La Alteña, the home of Tequila Ocho. This distillery has been there since 1937, founded by the master distiller Carlos Camarena's grandfather. Going over to what we call the patio, where we bring all the agaves. You can see some brown spots on there. We call that pinto or pintada. So that's a concentration of sugar on the outside of the piñas, loading them into the oven. We use traditional stone brick ovens, so cooked above ground using steam, 85 degrees Celsius for about 72 hours. After cooking, we obviously have to mill the agave, so we use a molino, a roller mill. You can see it's a very fibrous plant, so it's splitting the juice and separating the juice from the fibers. There you see the juice, the aguamiel, and the juice is fermented without the fibers. That is our sister brand's Tapatio en el Tesoro when we were filming this. So this is not Ocho's fermentation here, but we use pine vats, pine wood vats, and then double pot distillation, finishing in one of those little 350 liter fully copper pot stills. And of course, we're not going to really be talking about aging today, but Dawn was talking about, you know, light aging in order to really highlight the raw material, which is exactly what we do for Tequila Ocho. If you look at the añejo and reposado there, this is the North American packaging, by the way. It is very, very light in color. So that's a quick 2.5 or 3 minute tour of La Alteña. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. And I think an important point here to make is that the production process stays exactly the same batch to batch, right? We use natural airborne yeast, so yeast will change over time. It is one of the variables in our production process that is not exactly a control variable, right? Water, we use our own spring, right? Which is on the distillery itself. So the water will change a little bit over time, but in general, the production process stays exactly the same. So just to explain what we do with Tequila Ocho, it very much came from a wine inspiration. I'm just going to share a little map with you here. Can everyone see a little map where my face used to be? So it actually, Burgundy's been mentioned a number of times in the chat. My father for 30, I think about 30 years, starting in the mid 80s, would go to the en primeur tastings every year in Burgundy, right? So he was really fascinated, almost to the point of obsession, with this concept of terroir in the wine world, which, as Dawn said, has been understood for really hundreds of years. In spirits, not so much. So when he had the opportunity to create a brand of tequila with Carlos Camarena, which would later become Tequila Ocho, one of the first things he said was, Carlos, could we create the first quote unquote single vineyard tequila, right? Single field tequila. And we're going to be harvesting our 30th field now, basically soon in the next few days or weeks. And what we find, and you have two samples here. Let me put myself back on video here. You have two samples, hopefully, Dawn, there. The first, well, I don't know what order they're in, but the first one for me is 2016 Potrero Grande. Okay, this was a very, very small field that was, the yield was so small, it was about 16,000 liters, that we actually didn't release it outside of Mexico. I think we sent about 50 cases to France just for fun, but this was a very, very small harvest that never made it to
reference,
the UK.
that will be your sample number 2 of the tequilas. It'll be
sample number 2.
It'll be your last tequila. The first tequila is the current El Pedregal. Before we get into this in too much detail, I think it's something interesting for some of the viewers to understand.
And actually, as Dawn is nosing those, and so to me, I have the 2 samples in front of me. I haven't even tasted them yet. I mean, I have tasted them, but not today, not this morning. I don't even need to taste them. The nose on the 2 are markedly different. So again, this is what I put forward to you guys. If terroir does not exist in spirits, and this is not a rhetorical question, please answer me in the chat. If terroir does not exist in spirits, where does that difference come from? that marked difference that we find just on the nose. And remember, these are 30 different fields with 30 different flavor profiles, basically.
And something that some people, anybody who's done level 2 or level 3 WSET will know this already, but not everybody knows this in the audience potentially. The blue agave, Weber blue agave plant that is used across Mexico is essentially the same plant propagated numerous times. It's not there. It's not as if it's like, oh, it's another expression of that variety. It is the same plant. It's propagated. It's not reproduced sexually. So they take offshoots and they propagate them. So it's extraordinarily genetically non-diverse. It is like lots of twins of the same plant everywhere, which is why agave in particular, blue agave in particular, provides us with this really interesting consistency of process. So it is the same plant, depending on what field it was grown in, it might grow differently. Depending on what the character was, it takes, in the case of Ocho, a minimum of 8 years to mature. So what was the weather like over that 8 years? Then in the fermentation, you're fermenting with wild yeast, but in the same distillery, and the distillation process is consistent, and we're not bringing barrel aging into the conversation yet. So I think tequila in particular, to talk about the difference between lowland and highland tequila is a well-established concept. But what we're really looking at here with Ocho is the difference of field to field and year to year. So sorry to interrupt, Jesse, but I just wanted to.
No. That's really helpful, Charlie. And yeah, so if we look at blue agave as a plant, exactly like you said, it's been deemed a monoculture, right? So every plant is virtually genetically identical. All the hundreds of millions of plants in the ground being grown for use in tequila production, which is quite strange to think about. So again, it just adds to that effect of when we look at these differences, we're talking about those are differences in soil composition, right? Altitude, orientation towards the sun. All of our fields are within the highlands, Los Altos. So that is one specific region of production for tequila. And yet the terroir is quite different. You know, I don't know how well you can see the map behind me or if I can point over here. So Potrero Grande is up here near Jesus Maria, where the altitude is even higher than most parts of the highlands. So we're talking about 2,150 or even up to 2,200 meters in those areas. El Pedregal, which is right near the distillery, it's about 1 kilometer away from our distillery. It's about 2,050 meters above sea level, that field. So again, we're talking about differences within one region, right? One specific region of the DO of tequila.
I mean, for you, these are vastly different on the nose. Dawn, Jesse, what are your main characteristics of each of these that you're picking up? Because one of them is here.
Yeah, there's this kind of, you know, Pedregal to me is more of that fruit-led, almost like stewed fruits, almost kind of that fresh peach on there. It's really pleasant. And yeah, Potrero Grande has some of those earthier notes, but still very rich.
Jesse, is one of these more on clay soil than it is on, is one more clay heavy? Does that
So Los Altos as a whole is pretty clay-rich soil, as you, I'm sure, know, Dawn. Both of these fields will have a high clay content, depending on where. So if we go to the south of, I'm trying to get out of the way of the map. Anyway, if you see in the south here of the map, there's 3 fields off kind of by themselves. That has a very, very different terroir for the highlands. We're dropping by around 500 meters down to those. So it's still quite high up, 1,700 meters above sea level, but not so much of that high clay content there. But in general, most of the fields, yeah.
Now I'm like, sorry, everyone. Can you tell, I mean, have you got enough experience now with all these vineyards to have done them multiple times so you can put your nose in and say, that is that vineyard? Or vineyard?
No. So because of the time it takes, this is, you know, this experiment, I was wondering. In a sense, it's an experiment, right? This experiment is quite time consuming because we harvest one field and it actually takes a lot more than 8 years until we're going to harvest that field again, because we do crop rotation, because the field rests and gets to lay fallow. And
so you haven't had one repeat yet?
We've had one repeat, which is El Vergel, which was 2007 harvest, one of our first harvests, and 2018 was the second harvest. But again, we want to do more of this to be able to really start to look at those similarities between, you know, over a decade of different harvests in the same field.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting comments coming in on the side about the difference between provenance and terroir, which I think is absolutely valid. I just want to draw everyone's attention, if I can, to a comment by Connors, better known as Connors, but actually his name here is Lee Connor, which is his real name. He does talk very much about the difference between the idea of the philosophical concept of terroir, which is kind of rooted in romanticism and nativism and the skill of the producer, and these are not metricable. You cannot find them on a spectrochromatograph. However, then if you're looking at proving terroir and looking at lab, you know, kind of analysis or sensory analysis, say this is specifically this. And I'm going to come back to this book again. I'm going to throw a little grenade into the middle of the conversation. A lot of what's been spoken about in terroir and age spirits at the moment is driven by Waterford whiskey, and I think that they've gone an extraordinarily long way to proving that terroir exists in barley distillate, because they have single fields and they have the varietals, the variety of each barley noted and the year. The question then becomes, as soon as wood comes into play, how much is happening? And also then there's a different question, is your wood, you talked about it as a grand experiment, Jesse, for a while. Let me unpin you from my screen so that everybody isn't, not that we don't want to look at your beautiful face writ large, but it's a democracy here, so we want to make sure everyone has the same space on the screen. Do you then need, if you are bringing wood in, the provenance of the wood, the previous contents of the wood, the species of the wood, the forest that the wood was grown in, and the consistency of that wood program across all of your distillates? If you then want to bring that into the question of terroir, does that need to be absolutely charted? Because if you're using a terminology like, say, vin du naturel, that covers a lot, and that covers a lot of flavor contribution. So I desperately want to go to Waterford. I desperately want to taste every single distillate that they've made. And I would love then to taste those distillates that have been aged in exactly the same barrel program. And it's early days in that experiment. And I know that there's interesting terroir experiments happening around cereal distillates. Let's say, let's be honest, I'm talking about whiskey. There are interesting experiments happening in America around this, in Ireland, in Scotland. I'm a big fan of the Isla barley releases that came from Bruichladdich. I think they're really interesting and delicious. I'm just going to drop that bomb and let whoever wants to pick up the baton on that run with it.
I might have a little bit to say about oak.
Okay.
I'm sitting there going, I did a very, very interesting tasting one time with a gentleman called Claude Giroux, who ages his champagnes in oak from a forest called the Argonne Forest, which is just outside of Champagne. And he gave me 3 wines blind, 3 Van Clairs. So Van Clair is the still wine before it goes through its second fermentation. He said, tell me what the difference was. I knows them, you know, I think I'm a good taster. Apparently not. I was like, okay, this is stainless steel fermented, this is cement tank fermented, and this is barrel aged ferment. Not a chance. They were all wood. They were all from the Argonne Forest. They were from different parts of the forest.
And that was dominant.
Absolutely. It was insane. It was as different as the 2 tequilas that Jesse's just given me to taste. And, you know, you look at the Limousin, the Trancet, Vosage, you look at using Amburana in cachaça, wood plays a huge role. Mm-hmm. But wood can kill terroir, because as soon as you put new wood onto anything, that becomes the dominant flavor, not the flavor of the thing coming through, unless the distillate or the wine, whatever, is got enough character within itself to hold that flavor still and to grow with it. Now, I'm not going to talk about Waterford because I have very strong views, but I will talk about oak and how it can overpower. And I think if you look at, say, I mean, Benoit, Jesse, you can both probably talk about this a lot better than I can when it comes to spirits, because you're looking at two very, very powerful flavors within. And I do think in both tequila, in the right amount. I'm not a great fan of big añejos that just taste like I'm chewing on a piece of cardboard. And same with rums that have been overpowered with oak. But I do still think that both in the right use and in the right way, using X, less sort of intense, well, second fill, third fill, whatever, could potentially have it, but still have to retain the character of the spirit has to come through. And in a certain whiskey that I will remain nameless about, it does not come through. End of.
Okay, well, there's another variable which we're going to throw in here, and it's something that Alessandro Fabro, who's commenting in putting into the comments here, he's studying a PhD on the concept of agronomic practices and how that affects terroir, and maybe that's right at the other end of the process. We're going like right back. With maybe something for Benoit within Rhum Agricole, are there different agronomic practices for the various different cane fields and farms or distilleries, or is it all just plant the cane and let it go and let it grow and be what it's going to be?
No, there are different practices actually. I think the latest practices one distillery is using, for example, is making their sugarcane plants grow in a greenhouse first before planting them when they're about 30 centimeters high into the soil. And it has been proven over this, they're working on this about 6 years now, and it has been proven that it makes a huge difference as well. They tend to produce more sugar. You have less sugarcane pods rotting in the field when you plant them, since, well, usually back then, they used to plant actually only by putting some sugarcane pieces into the soil and see what happens.
Okay.
So you maybe had like one piece every 10 pieces that grew. In this case, you are sure that everything you are planting is going to become a grown sugarcane pod. And so you're also giving more space in the soil to breathe and bring back more nutrients to the plant and everything. So this is going to make a huge difference as well. And basically, it gives you the ability to produce more and produce better, wasting less on the same surface.
Okay.
Martinique nowadays has the problem that it's an island. You cannot grow an island. And they have reached the maximum of capacity they can grow on the island in regard of the surface. So now it's about how can we produce more and better with the same surface. And that was one solution that has been proposed by Depaz 6 years ago. Okay,
so you're essentially taking a completely new approach to the agricultural aspect of the crop.
Yeah,
and this is really interesting. The conversation is expanding out far beyond the scope of what I even thought was going to be possible, which is wonderful. There's some excellent comments coming through. Got approximately 10 minutes left, 7 minutes, but we might end up stretching it a bit because I think it's worthwhile. I'm going to throw to the Q&As. Cesar Adamus asks, can we ask the others what they think about the human factor in terroir? Now, obviously, we just spoke about part of that with the agronomic practices. I've always wondered about this human factor, because I suppose we want to reframe the question a little bit, because it's important that we state at the outset that terroir isn't the aim. The aim is to make delicious spirits. The aim of the distiller is to make wonderful, delicious spirits. If terroir happens to be expressed along the way, that's a fantastic aspect, but that's almost never the goal, except maybe in Ocho's case, but maybe it can be both goals at the same time. So we're not talking about quality. We're not really talking about provenance. We're not even talking about success. We're talking about, is this something that happens? With this definition of the human contribution, is that just a fuzzy get out of jail free card, or is that a specific thing? There's shaking heads going.
I think it's a specific thing. Since, as Dawn said in the beginning of this panel, culture comes in place. And agricole rum nowadays is coming from the culture. I mean, 200 years ago in Martinique, they were producing rum out of molasses like anywhere else. And at some point, for different reasons, humans decided to make it differently and stop producing sugar and molasses by the same way and started producing rum out of sugarcane juice. So this has been the beginning of a new way to produce rum, and also the beginning of the expression of terroir at the very, very beginning. And this was actually built by humans. It was a human idea to make that at that point.
Dawn. Oh, sorry, you're on mute. It's the phrase of the.
I think Jesse had something, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it breaks down in lots of different ways, that human component of terroir. You know, in a very practical way, I think of it as if your distillery or your fields are located near, you know, a factory of some kind that's polluting the air or polluting the soil, that's a very direct human element that's going to affect terroir, right? Then there's what we would call the hand of the maker, what Ron Cooper from Del Maguey calls the hand of the maker. And what I've also heard referred to in Mexico as sazon. So kind of the effect, the effect that the producer has on their product. I call it kind of the thumbprint or the DNA almost. So Carlos Camarena has a style that when you taste Ocho, Tapatio, El Tesoro, you know, you get that style. So that's, I guess it's not terroir, but that is his influence on those tequilas, where if someone followed his recipe and produced tequila the same way, it wouldn't have that thumbprint on it. So that's kind of my view on the human element.
Sorry, Dawn.
No, yeah, I think it's hugely important. You know, I think if we look at kind of, Dave Brum's just writing a book at the moment, or it's just finished, called Sense of Place. And we've talked a lot about this idea of the human element. And, you know, it has a massive effect. And if you think about how that then transfers through generations, there's always shifts in styles and patterns and things. So even though you should have in the heart of it, let's take Glenlivet as an example. Glenlivet, for me, the heart of it is red apples. Mm-hmm. That red apples is shown through no matter who's the distiller, because that's something about Glenlivet. But there has been shifts in how Glenlivet tastes, you know, and not just through who's distilling it, but as the years have changed, fashions changed, cultures changed, marketeers influence.
Available woods, there's drift in the yeast strain. There's lots of influences, yeah.
Yeah, you know, the human is essentially, that is, as Benoit said, that's who created terroir. Mm-hmm. Terroir was created by someone saying, this tastes like this here, and we need to protect that. And, you know, and I think that's where spirits have to get much more strong, especially as we know the world of rum is a little bit maverick occasionally. And there's others, you know, we've seen the problems with Japan now. So, you know, it's protecting that sense of place is maybe what we should be talking about. How do you protect those cultures, those histories, those flavors that come from something? And will terroir be able to help in that conversation? And I think that's maybe a way of looking at it.
Yeah, so terroir is rather than as a marketing term, more as a positive influence on how we treat and respect the practices and cultures of the producers. Within all of our WSET courses from level 1 to 3 in spirits, we talk about the 4 stages of production. And what we're talking about here really is a lot of these are choices that are going to be made at a micro level every day in producing the spirit. How long am I going to let the ferment run? How am I going to control the temperature? What point I'm going to keep the cut? So it's almost impossible to remove these from what actually is in the glass. What is in the glass is always going to be absolutely influenced by the people who make the decisions, because guess what? Your agave isn't going to jump into a glass. It needs to get there by the hand of man, as Jesse said, or the hand of woman, as is very often the case in Ocho these days. I'm aware that we're getting close to the time. I'd like everybody, we had a poll at the start, so everybody who's watching, if you wouldn't mind, we're going to launch that same poll again. And I want to see, has there been any shift in the idea of does terroir exist in spirits?
And one comment that I'll make too, just to echo what Dawn has said, if I were to rephrase the question and say, do most are most spirits that claim to be terroir driven actually terroir driven? I would say no, 99% of the time. I agree that it's the buzzword of the day, whether you use the word terroir or it's single origin or it's single estate. In our case, I see so many spirits that say single estate. It doesn't mean anything in most cases. It's like Dawn said, it's like craft or artisanal or small batch was 10 years ago.
Oh, it's a very similar split to the first time. There's a couple of more no's in there. Some people have switched.
We lost some people. Yeah,
lots of people. Well, I think you're right. It's not really about does it exist.
Or we won them, Benoit. Depends which side you're on.
It's not so much does it exist, is can it be expressed and expressed well? And is, when we talk about terroir, is what we're talking about always what the marketing team is talking about?
Death to all marketeers, that's what I say.
I'm very Bill Hicks all of a sudden. Well, not all of a sudden, we always knew you were. I think we've come to a really nice moment to wrap it up. I think I really appreciated the contributions from everybody here. I'll be honest, I'm just a conduit for this. You guys know all, and girls know all a lot more about this than I do. I'm just going to throw to each of you. Dawn, if you had a favorite spirit that you'd say this expresses terroir, can you name one or two that come to mind without being I'm brand neutral, so I'm gonna.
I'm a Claran girl through and through.
Go there.
You and Claran, but also I do think just looking at these two Ochos. I mean, I've always been a massive fan of Ocho, and I'm very, very excited to see these in 50 years' time if I'm still alive and see, are there recognizable differences between it? I think Agricole rum is one of the most amazing spirits in the world. I think we're very blessed to have some incredible spirits like cognac and ones that really do speak of terroir. So I can't pick a favorite. I mean, I was picked Sushi, but no, I can't pick a favorite because it again, we're part of terroir. It's what we feel like drinking on what time, what day, and with who. Yeah, that's part of it as well.
Even if, and I'm sure you've noticed, I've been spitting along the way, which is part of best practice. We do all have to work later in the day. Benoit, obviously you showed us a great example there of a single field varietal. For you, what does terroir mean in terms of just in the world of spirits? Do you feel that it has a place, or do you feel that we have to be very specific about it?
In my point of view, terroir is a signature. A signature could be of a country, of a region, and even of a brand or a distillery. And it's basically everything that brings together this signature and makes it unique. What is unique about this distillery or this place or this region? I mean, if it's a signature of a region like Martinique, you have the AOC that brings together all the distilleries and tries to make them agree on at some point that rums from our country have to taste like this. And there's a chart. But inside of this chart, each distillery has its specifications. So that's a sub-signature. Could be called a sub-terroir if you want. But it's definitely, to me, everything that makes your product unique in comparing it with some others. And that as much as in process, as in culture, as know-how, but also in taste. And I think the most important part of this is the taste.
Absolutely. It's what's in the glass. Jesse, just to throw to you, very last moment, I think something that's really come out of this conversation that's got me thinking in a lot of ways, and thank you all for opening up the various different branches of this conversation, is the role that terroir can have in protecting a culture in terms of the production styles and the choices and the heritage of that culture. Obviously, within tequila and within agave spirits, we know that that culture is under broad attack from a lot of different places at the moment, and it's got a huge susceptibility underlining it, with the Proyecto del Murciélago, the BAT project and the Pollination project is trying to address. For you, where do you see terroir playing a role in the future of that culture within the context of tequila?
Yeah, I mean, tequila, you mentioned agave spirits, because mezcal is a big question and a big debate, and it's a bit of a mess now because there's a lot of growing pains as to how do you protect that without excluding people that have been producing mezcal for generations and hundreds of years in their family in some cases. So I think well, mezcal and tequila are different. So sticking with tequila, no, I think that the CRT have done a good job with creating the current denomination of origin. And there's an agave shortage, but everyone, there's a lot of space. It's not like the islands that Benoit was mentioning, that they're running out of space. We still have space, so I don't think that's the issue. And the bat friendly project that you mentioned is a very long-term project as well, that we aim to naturally reintroduce genetic diversity into the blue agave species using bats. Why? Because the plant flowers at night, being nocturnal, the blue agave, and bats being nocturnal feed on those that pollen at night. So that's a whole other topic. But yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of struggling to respond to your question of how terroir fits into that. But
well, do you know what? We don't have to have all the answers today. This is a conversation that's just going to run and run and run, and maybe we might come back for a different take on it at a different time. But for now, I just want to say thank you very much, Jesse Estes, Benoit Bail-Danel, and Dawn Davies. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much to everybody who's participated. The chat section has been going nuts. The questions have been very interesting. It has all been super interesting. Thank you so much for your participation, and Sláinte.
Cheers. Thanks for having us.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, the thank yous are coming in on it.